I'll never go camping again. I lost my dad 2 years ago while we were on a camping trip, and I can't shake a single detail of that day from my mind. It was early morning, sometime in mid-October, and as usual, Dad was up and ready for our yearly camping trip. "Come on, get up, get dressed, and let's hit the road," he called out to me. My eyes slowly fluttered open as I dragged myself into consciousness. "I'm up, Dad, just need to get my gear together," I replied, though I wasn't really moving as fast as I claimed. "I'll be down in 15, I added, not entirely truthfully. Eventually, I got dressed, grabbed my bag, and made my way downstairs. Dad was already outside, busy checking the truck's engine, while Mom was in the kitchen, watching the morning news. "Your dad said to send you out when you came down," she told me. I rushed over to her, planting a quick kiss on her cheek. "Love you, Mom." "I'll see you in a couple of days," I said. She returned the sentiment, giving me a hug before shooing me out the door. By the time I got outside, Dad was finishing up packing the last bit of our gear, so I just tossed my stuff in the car and waited for him to wrap up. "Son, come give me a hand with this," Dad called out. I walked over, grinning. "What's up, Pops? Getting too old for this stuff?" I teased him. "I'll never be too old to whoop your ass," he shot back with a laugh. But then, just like that, his whole demeanor shifted. He got serious, almost somber. "Tony, listen to me, if anything ever happens, don't go camping again," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made me pause. "What's that supposed to mean, Dad?" I asked, confused, but he just brushed it off and went right back to what he was doing, like he hadn't just dropped that on me. I tried to shrug it off, too, and got back to loading up the gear. We finished packing everything, loaded up the truck, and climbed in. My dad was one of those genuinely good men, the kind who'd give you the shirt off his back. He was always cracking jokes, caring, and made you feel like you could take on the world. But he had this quiet side too, a distance that I always figured had something to do with his time in the military. He never really talked about it, but Mom would sometimes say, "Your dad came home when the war ended, but his mind stayed on the battlefield." There were nights when he'd wake up screaming, and I'd hear Mom soothing him, telling him everything was okay. Still, most of the time, he was an incredible man who treated us like we were the most important people in the world. "So, you all set for this year's camping trip, kiddo?" Dad asked, trying to sound cheerful. "Of course I am, Pops," I lied right through my teeth. The truth was, I was 16 now, and with a girlfriend, camping was starting to feel like something for little kids. But I couldn't let him know that, it would have crushed him. I knew how much these trips meant to him, so I played along. "You sure you're not upset about leaving your little girlfriend back home?" Dad teased with a grin. I just brushed off the comment with a sigh, not really in the mood to banter. He chuckled and kept driving us out to the campsite. It took us about 4 hours to get there, deep into the middle of nowhere, California, nothing but towering trees and even taller mountains. Our campsite was perched right on the edge of a cliff. As soon as we arrived, I started unloading the camping gear from the truck. I noticed Dad pacing around, muttering something under his breath as he moved about the area, checking things out as he liked to call it. He seemed a bit on edge, but I didn't think much of it and kept hauling the gear. After about an hour or so, we had the camp all set up. It was around 3 p.m. by then, and both of us were starting to get hungry. "Let's head down to the river and catch us some dinner," Dad suggested. I nodded, and we started the short hike down to the water. It only took about 5 minutes to reach the river from our campsite. When we got there, I noticed that the cliff our campsite was on overlooked the river. The water was wild, with rapids so loud they rumbled in your chest like the engines of a plane. Dad led us down the riverbank to where it split off into a calmer creek. He explained that the slower water was better for catching fish, but then suddenly, he went quiet. I glanced over and saw him standing there, staring off into the woods, whispering something I couldn't quite make out. His eyes had this glazed-over look, like he was somewhere far away. For a moment, I thought I caught him saying something like this last time, but I wasn't sure. Concerned, I walked closer to him, trying to figure out what was going on. Dad, are you okay? I said, but he didn't move an inch. I looked out into the woods, but seeing nothing. I reached out to grab his shirt. Dad? I fearfully asked. Fingers outreached, trembling towards him. All of a sudden he snaps out of it, twisting his head towards me, smiling. The slower water is perfect for catching fish, son, he said. His head twisting slowly back towards the river. I was quick to notice that this episode looked a lot like the symptoms of my father's PTSD, but he immediately snapped out of it. I was creeped out, to say the least. The way he turned his head back towards the water scared me a little. I've never been afraid of my father, but that scared me. Son, hand me my fishing pole, let's see if we can get us some grub, he said. I handed him the pole and we began to fish. We caught what seemed like 100 fish. It basically turned into sport, seeing who could catch the most. The entire time we were fishing and laughing, the episode played in my head on repeat. I tried my best to just forget it and enjoy the day with my dad. We went back to the campsite after fishing for a couple of hours. We scaled the fish, gutted them, and skewered them on some branches and began to cook them. Dad grabbed a beer out of his cooler, sat down with a piece of wood, and began to whittle it. I stood at the cliff and looked at the river. I grabbed a rock and chucked it down into the water. I'd say we were about 75 feet up, but I wasn't sure. I turned and looked at my dad, wanting to question him about what happened today, but I couldn't. Maybe I was too afraid to trigger his PTSD, I'm not sure what it was, but I couldn't. Dinner finished and we sat down to eat. Besides the creepiness of the day, I'd say it went pretty well. Dad cleaned up the dishes and I started to gather more wood for the coming day. By this time it was about 8 p.m. and we were winding down. How was your dinner, son? He asked. It was awesome, Dad, thanks for cooking, I said. He shot me a thumbs up and started whittling the wood again. Hey Dad, what happened to you on the river today? I worriedly asked. What do you mean? He asked. You froze up, Dad, and repeated something you just told me, I said. Froze up? What are you talking about? He asked, agitated. It was nothing, Dad, you must not have heard me, I said. I haven't been sleeping very well, that's all, don't worry about it, okay, son? He said, calming down. He gestured over to his sleeping bag. Emma hit the hey son, it'll wake you up early morning so we can go hunt, he said. All right, good night, love you, Dad, I said. He disappeared into his tent and I did the same. I fell asleep quite fast from the activities of the day. All of a sudden I'm woken up to a scream. Not just any scream, but it sounded to me like the scream of someone being tortured. As soon as I sat up in my tent, it went quiet. No bugs, no fire crackling, no river, nothing. I unzipped my tent slowly and stuck my head outside. It was pitch black outside except for the glow of the moon on objects. I climbed out of my tent and made my way to Dad's tent. I unzipped it and stuck my head in. Dad, are you okay? I said. All I could hear was my father mumbling in his sleep. My father was having a conversation with himself. You can't take them, they're my family, he whispered. All of a sudden a voice came out of my father that couldn't have been his own. A deep guttural voice, almost demon-like. I'll take you first, then I'll take them, it growled with a menacing tone. I stumbled backward out of the tent, hitting the ground hard. My heart pounded in my chest as fear gripped me. Tony, are you all right? Dad asked, poking his head out of the tent. Yeah, sorry, Dad, I was just checking on you, I stammered, trying to sound calm despite my trembling voice. Are you okay, Dad? I asked, concerned. He nodded, assuring me everything was fine, and told me to go back to bed. The rest of the night was quiet. I lay in my sleeping bag for what felt like hours, replaying that voice over and over in my head. Something about it just didn't feel like PTSD, it was something else, something much darker. The following day was pretty normal. We hiked around a bit, did some more fishing, and gathered wood for the night. Dad didn't say much all day, and he seemed a bit on edge, but otherwise, it was another decent day. I didn't dare bring up what I heard him say in his sleep. I wasn't even sure he'd remember, let alone want to talk about it. "All right, son, I'm turning in," Dad said as the day came to an end. "Love you, Pops." "See you in the morning," I replied, not knowing those would be the last words I'd ever say to him. As I crawled into my tent, a wave of anxiety washed over me. The events of the previous night burned into my memory, but I forced myself to stop thinking about it, to just calm down and be brave. But then, out of nowhere, I heard a noise, like the sound of bones crunching and meat tearing, moving through our camp toward the cliff. I jumped up and scanned the darkness, trying to find the source of the sound. That's when I saw it. A silhouette of my dad stood motionless at the edge of the cliff, whispering something as he stared down at the river. I gasped in horror and sprinted toward him, my heart racing. I got within 10 feet of him and froze. I could finally make out what he was saying. "You can have me, but not them. This is the last time you hurt me," he whispered, his voice full of resolve. "Dad, are you—" Before I could finish my sentence, he turned to me with a look of calm determination and said, "Never agree to go camping again, son." Then, without hesitation, he leaped off the cliff. "No!" I screamed, the shock hitting me like a freight train. I stood there, numb, unable to process what had just happened. Slowly, the reality began to sink in, and I started to sob. I ran to the edge of the cliff, but there was nothing I could do. I stared into the blackness below, the roaring river filling my ears as panic set in. I needed to get help, immediately. I grabbed the truck keys and drove home as fast as I could, the whole 4-hour drive passing in a blur. The entire time, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Dad sitting in the back. By the time I reached home, I was in shock. I rushed inside and told my mother everything that had happened. She collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably. We called the authorities, and they sent out a search team, but they found nothing, not a single trace of my father. It was like he had vanished into thin air. That was 2 years ago. I'm 18 now, and our annual trip is coming up again. I haven't gone camping since that day. I moved away after it happened. But this weekend, I'm going back to stay with my mom. The night I arrived was the night before the annual trip. I got in, greeted my mother, and we had dinner together. That night, I woke up with a cold chill running down my spine. The room was so silent, it was almost unnerving. Then, out of the darkness, I heard a whisper. "Son, get up," it said, faint and eerie. I sat up in bed and rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the grogginess. That's when I saw it, a face peering in at me from the bottom of the window, staring into the backyard. My heart nearly stopped. It was my father's face. His skin was ghostly white, his hair matted and wild, and his eyes were black and filled with malevolence. He began to speak, his voice low and chilling. "Son, are you ready to go camping?" he asked, raising a hand and tapping on the window with long, sharp fingernails. Tap, 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 the sound echoed in the stillness of the night. "I've missed you all this time, son." "Why did you leave me?" he whimpered, his voice filled with sorrow. His mouth began to open wider than any human mouth should, stretching until it tore at the corners, his jaw unhinging like some horrific creature. I jumped out of bed, stumbling backward in terror, unable to tear my eyes away from the nightmare before me. I didn't say anything, I couldn't. I backed away slowly, and his eyes followed my every move. Desperate, I flicked on the light, and just like that, he was gone. The room was empty, as if nothing had happened. Panicking, I bolted out of my room and into my mom's. "Mom, are you awake?" I asked, my voice trembling with fear. "Yes, I'm awake, son." "What's wrong?" she replied, her voice calm, almost too calm. "Mom, we need to leave right now, something's outside, and it—" She cut me off mid-sentence. "He can't get you, son, if you don't agree to go camping," she said, rolling over and going right back to sleep. "Mom, what the hell does that even mean?" I yelled, But she ignored me, her words only adding to my confusion and frustration. What was happening? Was I losing my mind? Had I really just seen my dead father staring at me through the window? Determined to find out, I decided to go outside and check for myself. There was no way I'd be able to sleep without knowing for sure. I walked around the house to where my window was, but there was nothing there, just the quiet woods stretching out behind our house, as still and empty as ever. "Won't you go camping with me, son?" a voice called from the woods, soft and pleading. "Won't you please?" I froze in my tracks, slowly turning to face the direction the voice had come from. "I'm going to get you, just like I got your dad," it screeched, the voice rising to a piercing scream. Suddenly, a bright, white figure, completely naked and crawling on all fours, scuttled out of the woods, racing toward me with horrifying speed. It screamed, an ear-splitting sound that made my blood run cold. I fell backward, hitting the ground hard, my heart pounding as I closed my eyes, bracing for the end. The screams grew louder, closer, until they were almost on top of me. I felt long, bony fingers wrap around my ankles, the sharp nails digging into my skin. This is it, I thought to myself. The thing that killed Dad is going to kill me too. But then, as those terrifying thoughts raced through my mind, I remembered Dad's last words, "Never agree to go camping again, son." Suddenly, I snapped out of my fear. "I'm not going camping with you!" I screamed at the top of my lungs, covering my eyes with my hands. Silence. I slowly pried my hands away from my face, expecting to see some unspeakable horror. But there was nothing, no creature, no sign that anything had even been there. At my feet, I found a small wooden cross, the words Father and Son carved into it. It was the cross my father had whittled on our last camping trip. I picked it up, clutching it tightly. To this day, I keep that cross with me. I don't know if I'm losing my mind, but I know one thing for certain, I'm never camping again.